Hello friends, especially to our wise and wonderful seniors tuning in. Imagine spending your whole life building something. Your name, your business, your dignity. And then one morning at the airport, it all gets questioned. Not because of what you did, but because of what you look like. Meet Charles, a calm, well-dressed man in his 60s, with silver hair, a proud heart, and a first-class ticket. But when he walks up to the gate, the young flight attendant doesn't see his success. She just sees his skin. She stops him cold and says, "Sir, are you sure you're in the right line?" What she doesn't know is who he really is. Because in the next few minutes, Charles makes one quiet phone call, and what happens after leaves the entire airline shaking. Stay with us. This story will remind you why grace, patience, and just the right amount of power still speak the loudest. And don't forget, you're watching the Storytales. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that touch the heart. It was just past 7:30 on a Monday morning, and the terminal at Houston International Airport hummed with the soft chaos of early flights. Business travelers wheeled sleek black suitcases behind them, parents juggled strollers and juice boxes, and sleepy-eyed attendants repeated boarding calls over tinny intercoms. It was a scene as ordinary as any other weekday morning in America. And in the middle of it all walked a man named Charles Bennett. He didn't move like someone in a rush. No, his walk was steady. His chin was high, and his shoes clicked with calm authority on the polished tile floors. He wore a deep navy blue tailored suit, crisp white shirt, silver cufflinks that caught the morning light, and a soft leather briefcase in hand. His skin was a rich brown, smooth and clean-shaven. His eyes, alert, kind, focused. To most, he might have looked like a senior executive heading to a board meeting, or a respected professor on his way to a keynote speech. But to the young woman behind the gate, a 17 counter, none of that seemed to matter. Charles stepped up to the gate, ticket and ID in hand, and said in his smooth baritone voice, "Good morning. I'm here to board Flight 782 to New York. First class, Seat 1A. The gate agent, a white woman in her late 20s with blonde hair pinned in a no-nonsense bun, didn't even look at the seat number. She glanced at his face, then quickly at his clothes, and gave him a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, sir," she said, tapping at her keyboard without real interest, "this line's for first-class passengers only. Coach is down that way." She pointed behind him, toward the other end of the terminal. Charles blinked, confused for a moment. "I am in first class," he said politely, handing over his boarding pass. She barely glanced at it. "Right, but are you sure it's not a complimentary upgrade? Maybe points. Let me check." The tone in her voice wasn't one of customer service. It was condescension, slicked with suspicion. She looked back at him the way someone might eye a stranger on their porch. He stood tall, his voice still calm. "I booked this seat months ago. Business trip. My name is Charles Bennett." More people had joined the line now, some glancing toward the commotion. The gate agent's voice grew sharper. "Sir, I'm asking you not to hold up the line. We need to keep the boarding process moving. I'll call security if necessary." That did it. The hum of the terminal seemed to dull. Charles looked behind him and saw the furrowed brows of travelers watching, pretending not to. One woman clutched her pearls. Another man, in a gray suit and Bluetooth headset, muttered, "Here we go again." And just like that, it wasn't about a boarding pass anymore. Now let's pause here, just for a moment. Imagine being in Charles's shoes. You've spent years, decades, working your way up in a world where your skin color is too often seen before your resume. You've endured the awkward silences in elevators, the stolen glances in boardrooms, the questions about whether you really belong in places you worked twice as hard to reach. And here you are. You bought the ticket. You earned the seat. You followed every rule. But the look in that agent's eyes tells you none of that matters. Because to her, you just don't look the part. Charles took a deep breath. Ma'am, I have a first-class ticket. I've done nothing wrong. Please scan it, and we can both move on. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped back and picked up the phone. Security to gate A17, she said flatly. I have a passenger refusing to comply with boarding procedures. Charles stood perfectly still. He could feel the stares now, not just curious, but judgmental. People weren't wondering what was going on. They were assuming. Assuming he was a problem. A disruption. A threat. The murmurs started. What's he doing? Why doesn't he just go to coach? Typical. And that's when two uniformed security guards appeared. One tall, one stocky, both wearing stern expressions like badges of honor. Sir, the tall one said, step away from the counter. I have a valid ticket, Charles replied, holding it up. There must be some mistake. We can sort it out inside, the stocky one interrupted. But you need to come with us. No ID check. No questions. No confirmation. Just two white guards escorting a black man away in full view of the public. Charles glanced one last time at the gate agent. She wouldn't meet his eyes. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. Not rage, not fear. Resolve. He was done being polite. Done accepting quiet insults under the disguise of policy. So as he walked away from the gate, surrounded by guards who had never even asked his name, Charles reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled once, tapped twice, and then raised the phone to his ear. Get me the board, he said. His voice was calm, but cold as steel. We have a situation. The private screening room wasn't much more than a small, sterile space behind a pair of double doors labeled Authorized Personnel Only. It was cold, both in temperature and in attitude. The kind of room built not for comfort, but for control. Charles sat in the lone chair, hands calmly resting on his knees, while the two security guards loomed near the door. They didn't speak. They didn't ask if he needed anything. They simply watched him, like a man under suspicion. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't raised so much as an eyebrow. But here he sat, because of a look. A snap judgment. A gate agent who didn't see a CEO, only a black man who, in her eyes, couldn't possibly belong in seat 1A. Charles could feel the pressure building behind his chest, not from fear, but from years of microaggressions and insults passed off as policy. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his mother. He remembered her voice, the way she used to say, "Never let them steal your dignity, son. The world will try. But you hold your head high." And so, he did. He opened his eyes, unlocked his phone, and dialed that same number again. The one labeled, Private Line, HQ. The voice on the other end picked up instantly. "Mr. Bennett? Is everything all right?" Charles spoke evenly, his words like the calm before a storm. "No. I've just been removed from my own flight. Flight 782. Houston to New York. First class seat 1A. By your staff." Silence. Then panic. "You were what?" "Escorted out. Humiliated. No one checked my ID. No one scanned my ticket. They didn't ask who I was. And they didn't care. I'll escalate this. Immediately. Please give me 5 minutes." "No," Charles replied. "You have 3. Back at the gate, chaos had replaced routine. Passengers murmured and whispered like ripples through still water. The flight had stopped boarding. The airline staff scrambled. The blonde gate agent stood frozen, holding her tablet like a shield. She was pale now, the fake smile long gone. A senior supervisor, red tie, clipboard, panic in his eyes, stormed up to her. "What happened?" he hissed. I just followed procedure." He refused to move. "I thought it was fraud." "You thought wrong," the supervisor snapped. "You just refused boarding to Charles Bennett." Her eyes blinked blankly. "Who?" He leaned in, his voice low and sharp. "The man who owns this airline. He's the CEO of Jet Air Holdings. And you had him escorted off the flight like some threat." At that moment, Charles re-entered the terminal. He was no longer escorted. He was accompanied by 2 corporate regional managers and the director of airline operations, flown in from the executive office just across town. They didn't walk beside him. They walked behind him. Because now they understood exactly who he was. Heads turned. Passengers whispered. Someone said out loud, "That's the guy they kicked off earlier." Another muttered, "Wait, he's the CEO?" They kicked off the CEO. The gate agent took a step back when she saw him return. Her eyes darted around for a place to hide. But there was nowhere to run. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw insults or threats. He simply looked at her, straight in the eyes, and said, "You looked at me and decided I didn't belong. And you were wrong." The supervisor stammered, "Mr. Bennett, please, allow us to offer our sincerest apologies. This was a horrible misunderstanding. We've grounded the flight until this is corrected." Charles didn't blink. "Grounded? You think this ends with an apology and a delay?" He turned to the regional manager. "How many times has this happened to other passengers who couldn't call corporate? Who didn't have my name or my phone book? You don't just owe me an apology. You owe every single black and brown traveler who's been profiled in your terminals and silenced at your gates." The man looked shaken. "We'll conduct a full review." Charles nodded slowly. "You'll do more than that. I want names. I want reports. I want retraining across every major airport you service. And I want a public statement. Not in a newsletter. I want it national." The terminal fell silent around him. He wasn't speaking just for himself anymore. He was speaking for every father, mother, student, and child who had been stopped, stared at, or searched, for daring to look successful while black. Back in the terminal's first-class lounge, news traveled fast. A passenger sitting near the window opened his phone and read the trending headline. "Jet Air CEO denied boarding by own staff, discrimination or mistake." An older woman in pearls muttered, "Good for him. They never expect the ones they look down on to fight back." A young black man in a hoodie whispered to himself, "Maybe next time, they'll think twice." Charles stood still for a moment, then finally took his boarding pass and handed it back to the agent. "Scan it," he said. "I'm still taking this flight." But the agent didn't move. The regional manager stepped in and gently took the scanner from her. He scanned the pass, handed it back to Charles with both hands, and said, "We are deeply sorry, sir." Charles gave a single nod and walked through the gate without looking back. And so, the man they tried to shame in public walked with dignity and purpose, boarding a flight he'd already earned, not just with money, but with a lifetime of patience, pride, and perseverance. And while the rest of the world now scrambled to make it right, Charles had already done what few could. He reminded them that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it just walks in wearing a tailored suit and makes one call. Charles Bennett was not just a CEO. He was the embodiment of a story so rarely told, yet so deeply American. His rise wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't handed to him. Charles grew up in the southern heat of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, raised by a single mother named Louise who worked 2 jobs, one at the post office by day, and the other cleaning offices at night. Charles remembered watching her soak her feet in Epsom salt every evening, her eyes half closed from exhaustion but always managing a smile when he brought her a glass of water. She used to say, "This ain't forever, baby. You're going to be the one to break the chain." And break it he did, but not without bruises. Not without moments like this morning, where the world still tried to remind him that no matter how far he'd come, it would always question whether he belonged. Back in the day, Charles didn't own a car. He used to ride his bike 5 miles to school, rain or shine, and then take the bus an hour across town to a community college that didn't even have a full science lab. But he was hungry, not just for knowledge, but for dignity. He studied by streetlight, worked weekends at a mechanic shop, and skipped every spring break to intern wherever someone would let him sweep floors or file paperwork. Eventually, his grades caught the attention of a retired professor who helped him transfer to Howard University. That was where Charles found his fire. Surrounded by brilliant minds who looked like him, sounded like him, and dreamed as big as him, he began to shape a vision of something far bigger than himself. He majored in aviation business management and interned at regional airlines during summer breaks. He learned how airlines worked, how the profit margins ran thin, how customer experience could make or break a brand, and how systemic bias seeped into hiring, training, and everything in between. He climbed the ranks slowly, methodically. First as a junior analyst for a budget airline. Then as a regional operations director. Then as vice president of strategy for a major carrier. Through it all, Charles kept his head down and his standards high. No shortcuts. No compromises. He built a reputation not just for being smart, but for being unshakable. Calm under pressure. Relentless in pursuit of excellence. By the time he was offered the top job at Jet Air Holdings, he had already turned down 2 CEO offers. He wasn't looking for a title. He was looking for the right stage, the right platform to not just succeed, but to change the system from within. Jet Air had been on the brink when he took over, losing customers, struggling with lawsuits, suffering from years of poor leadership. Within 5 years, Charles had transformed the brand into one of the top-rated airlines for reliability and customer satisfaction. He introduced diversity hiring initiatives, brought in sensitivity training programs, and opened mentorship opportunities for young pilots and engineers from underrepresented backgrounds. His vision wasn't just to fix planes and profits. It was to fix people's experiences, to reshape the very culture of the skies. But even then, with all those accomplishments, Charles knew there would be days when none of it would matter. Days like today. Days when one gate agent, with a tight smile and an assumption, could unravel decades of work with a single glance. As his flight began to taxi down the runway, Charles stared out the window, watching the tarmac disappear behind him. He wasn't angry anymore. No, he was reflective. His thoughts weren't on revenge. They were on his mother. On the young man in the hoodie back in the lounge. On every little girl who might one day stand at a gate and hesitate before saying, "I'm in first class." He knew the moment in the terminal wasn't just about one man and one misunderstanding. It was about every invisible line drawn in airports, offices, classrooms, and boardrooms across America. He didn't need applause. He didn't even need an apology anymore. What he needed was change. Measurable, visible, permanent change. And now, he had the full attention of the airline, the media, and the public. When the plane lifted into the sky, Charles pulled out his notebook. Not a laptop, not a tablet. Just a simple black leather journal he'd carried since his first day at Jet Air. Inside, he wrote 3 words on a blank page: New Training Standard. He underlined it twice. Then beneath it, he scribbled, Real Accountability. Customer-facing roles. Immediate bias response teams. Quarterly reviews. Public reporting. His hand moved quickly, the words flowing like water bursting through a dam. For him, this was no longer just about damage control. This was legacy. He knew the headlines were already spreading. Phones were buzzing. Executives were scrambling. But none of that fazed him. He'd dealt with crisis before. He just never had to be the subject of it to prove his point. And now, in an ironic twist, the very act meant to strip him of his dignity had only magnified his power. He didn't seek vengeance. He sought restoration, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been denied their place, their moment, their seat. And in doing so, Charles Bennett wasn't just flying first class anymore. He was flying above every assumption that had tried to keep him grounded. By the time Charles Bennett's flight landed at JFK, the world had already caught wind of what had happened at Gate 12B. The story wasn't whispered anymore, it was broadcast. It had grown wings of its own, circling through social media, flashing across TV tickers, and echoing through every airport lounge in America. And while Charles quietly disembarked and made his way through the terminal like any other passenger, the eyes of an entire nation were now fixed on him. Black CEO kicked off his own flight, jet air in hot water over racial profiling. That was the first headline. Then came the others. Charles Bennett humiliated by his own airline. First-class seat, second-class treatment. Jet Air's shining star, now its greatest scandal. But Charles didn't flinch. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't issue a statement from the tarmac or rush to social media. He just walked, silent and steady, his briefcase in one hand, and a nation's reckoning trailing in his shadow. Inside the Jet Air executive offices, however, panic was not walking, it was sprinting. Emails piled up by the hundreds. News outlets requested interviews, statements, explanations. HR was flooded. Legal was on standby. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. And at the center of it all was one question everyone was too ashamed to say out loud. How could this happen? How could you profile the man whose name was on the stockholder letters? How could you fail to recognize the very leader who'd saved this airline from bankruptcy and turned it into a model of equity and performance? But Charles had known this was always possible. Because the truth was, to many, he wasn't a CEO until they were told he was. Until they saw the credentials, the title, the consequence. And that was the point. Across the country, the public wasn't waiting for corporate spin. The response was immediate and visceral. Talk radio lit up with angry voices, some in defense, many in outrage. At a small barbershop in Atlanta, a retired veteran named Harold shook his head and muttered, "If a man like that can get treated like dirt, what chance do the rest of us have?" At a community center in Chicago, a group of teens studying for college entrance exams pulled up the video clip of the incident that a fellow passenger had recorded. It had already been viewed over 2 million times. In it, Charles remained calm, composed, never raising his voice as the gate agent grew visibly uncomfortable. One of the teens said, "He didn't even have to yell. That's power." And on the other side of the country, a woman named Martha, 74, white, retired, sat in her living room in Des Moines and turned to her husband and said, "I don't care what anyone says." That was racism. Plain and simple. Cable news hosts debated it live. Civil rights organizations issued swift statements. Advocacy groups began circulating petitions calling for widespread reform in airline training practices. Hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #IStandWithCharles trended for 3 straight days. Jet Air's customer service lines were overwhelmed with calls, some canceling flights, others demanding accountability. But amid all of it, Charles kept his phone on silent. He wasn't interested in internet applause or fleeting outrage. He was interested in transformation. And that required more than tweets. It required real consequences. Inside the boardroom on the top floor of Jet Air's Manhattan headquarters, the directors waited as Charles entered, late by exactly 3 minutes. He didn't come to defend himself. He didn't need to. He came to lead. He placed a printed copy of a 10-page proposal on the table. "This is what we're going to do," he began, his voice low and unwavering. "Not for damage control. Not for headlines. But because we can no longer pretend that isolated incidents are isolated causes. This company will lead the industry, not just in profit, but in principle." The plan included mandatory bias training for every employee, from gate agents to senior management. A new executive-level department of equity and passenger rights. Real-time auditing of passenger complaints categorized by race, gender, and age. An internal hotline that bypassed regional managers and reported directly to a 3-person independent ethics committee. Quarterly reports published publicly. Transparency not as a trend, but as a standard. There was silence at first. Then murmurs. Then questions. "What about the cost?" one board member asked. Charles looked him in the eye. "The cost of not doing this is far greater. We've already seen what silence buys. I won't lead a company that's comfortable ignoring the truth because it's expensive." Another director nodded slowly. "This could set a new standard in the industry." Charles replied, "That's the goal. We either lead the change, or get left behind by it." Outside the glass walls of that boardroom, a quiet storm of reform had already begun to take shape. Passengers wrote letters. Advocates organized forums. Former employees of other airlines stepped forward with their own stories. And every one of them pointed to Charles Bennett as the spark that reignited a much-needed conversation. Not because he was famous. Not because he was rich. But because he had handled injustice with grace and precision, the kind that couldn't be dismissed as overreaction or unruliness. And while the airline scrambled to issue a formal apology, Charles was already steps ahead. He didn't need their apology. What he needed, and what he demanded, was assurance. Assurance that no child, no student, no veteran, no business traveler of color would ever again be treated as a threat before they were recognized as a guest. He didn't want performative statements. He wanted verifiable change. He wanted culture shifts. He wanted to know that 20 years from now, when a young black woman stepped confidently into first class with a book in her hand and hope in her heart, she would be greeted with a smile, not suspicion. By the end of that week, Jet Air had published its apology. They didn't bury it. They made it headline news. Charles made sure of that. But what mattered more than the apology was what followed. Suspensions, firings, new hires, new policies, and for the first time ever, passengers of every color started to speak up not just about Charles, but about what they'd endured. He had, without intending to, ripped open the curtain. And in doing so, reminded everyone that change doesn't always come from yelling in the streets. Sometimes it comes from a man in a suit, holding a briefcase, with a boarding pass in one hand and a legacy in the other. What started as a moment of indignity at Gate 12B had become a national reckoning, but more than that, it had become a ripple that stretched across every terminal, every waiting lounge, every skybound seat in the country. Charles Bennett never set out to be a symbol. He didn't wake up that morning trying to make a point. He was simply a man boarding a flight, expecting to be treated with the same respect his white counterparts never had to think twice about. But that's the thing about change, it often comes not with speeches, but with stories. And Charles's story, his quiet resistance, his measured grace, had stirred something in people who had long grown used to swallowing their anger, biting their tongues, or simply walking away. Now, suddenly, they were stepping forward. Airlines across the nation found themselves under a microscope. Passenger stories began to surface, stories of being asked to prove they were really in first class, of being stared down while boarding, of being pulled aside for random searches that didn't feel random at all. And they were tired. Tired of the pattern. Tired of the excuses. And now, thanks to Charles, they had a voice loud enough to be heard. Jet Air had become the face of the scandal, but they weren't alone in their guilt. From coast to coast, internal memos started to circulate among airline staff, cautioning employees, warning them about conduct, encouraging sensitivity, all while trying not to admit that the problem had always been there. But where other companies ducked and covered, Charles forced Jet Air to stand tall and respond. He implemented a 3-month transformation campaign titled Airborne Equity, and it wasn't just lip service. From top executives to baggage handlers, the entire company underwent retraining, not the kind with slideshow screens and check-the-box answers, but immersive, emotional workshops featuring real stories from real passengers. He brought in educators, civil rights advocates, and even former airline workers who had quit due to the same systemic biases he was now tearing down. It wasn't easy. There were resignations. There were tears. But there was also a shift, subtle at first, then seismic. One of the most moving changes came from a retired flight attendant named Rosie. She had worked in the industry for 35 years and had seen everything, from hijackings to heart attacks midair. She stood up during a training session and said, with her voice cracking, "I never thought I was part of the problem. But I see now, that silence is just another form of participation." Charles was in that room. And he nodded slowly. Not in judgment, but in recognition. Because that was what this moment was about. Not blame, but accountability. Not shaming, but awakening. Passengers began to notice the difference, too. A young black couple on their honeymoon received a handwritten note from a gate agent apologizing for the way they had been stared at during boarding. An elderly Korean-American war veteran was offered a seat upgrade with the words, "Thank you for your service and your patience." Small things. Quiet things. But meaningful things. Charles didn't believe in performative change. He believed in seeds, planting them, watering them, and trusting they would grow long after the headlines faded. Meanwhile, back in Baton Rouge, Charles's mother's old neighborhood held a block party in his honor. They called it Flight for Respect Day. Kids wore cardboard pilot wings and paper badges. Local teachers used his story as a teaching moment in classrooms. "Mr. Bennett didn't yell, he didn't fight, he just stood his ground," said one teacher, her eyes wet with pride. And the whole world watched him do it. One of the kids held up a drawing he made of Charles standing tall at the gate with a caption that read, "My hero wears a suit, not a cape." But not everyone welcomed the change. There were critics, of course. Those who said Charles had overreacted. Those who called it a publicity stunt. One prominent commentator even suggested that the incident was exaggerated. But Charles didn't respond to any of it. He knew what had happened. The world had seen it. And he had no intention of arguing with small minds about a big problem. Instead, he focused forward, on building momentum, not defending himself. He told his team, "Let them talk. We've got planes to fix, people to serve, and a sky to change." And change it, he did. Within 6 months, Jet Air became the first major airline to publish its annual diversity and passenger treatment audit, unfiltered, unedited. Other airlines were now forced to follow. The Department of Transportation launched an investigation into racial profiling practices across all major carriers. Congress scheduled hearings. And suddenly, the issue of racial bias in air travel was no longer whispered about. It was being addressed head-on, and in full view of the American people. Charles had turned a gate into a platform, a seat into a statement, and a moment of humiliation into a movement. For Charles, the impact hit home in a deeply personal way one evening while walking through an airport in Dallas. A janitor, an older black man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, stopped him. No fanfare. No crowd. Just 2 men, quiet in a corridor between terminals. The man said, "I've been working in airports since 1979. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. And I've never felt seen. Until you, Mr. Bennett. Thank you." Charles placed a hand on the man's shoulder and replied, "It was time. Long overdue." And just like that, the ripple Charles started reached yet another soul. It didn't need cameras or applause. It just needed heart. Because in the end, Charles Bennett hadn't just disrupted an airline, he had lifted a nation. And as those ripples continued to stretch across the skies, they carried with them a quiet promise that dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. And anyone brave enough to claim it, even at 30,000 feet, just might bring us all a little closer to the ground we've always deserved to stand on. Months after that unforgettable day at Gate 12B, Charles Bennett's quiet stand had transformed into something much bigger than himself. He hadn't just changed one airline, he had changed the way America looked at flying, at fairness, and at the dignity every person deserves, no matter what seat they're in. Jet Air, once scrambling to save face, had become a national model for accountability. Their staff went through real, human-centered training. Their leadership made real policy changes. And they didn't stop there. They started showing up in communities, helping kids from all backgrounds dream about flying planes, not just riding in them. But Charles never sought attention. His idea of a legacy wasn't being on the front of magazines, it was in the little things. Like a young couple of color boarding a flight and being greeted with respect. Or a boy with brown skin and big dreams walking through the airport without getting stared at. These were the wins Charles counted most. He didn't lead from behind a desk, he led by example. Quietly, humbly, powerfully. One day, while waiting for a flight, Charles sat in an airport cafe and watched a young white gate agent greet an elderly black couple like they were royalty. "Right this way, sir. Ma'am, let me carry that for you." Charles just smiled. That moment said more than any headline ever could. A little kindness. A little humanity. That's all it ever took. Sure, the critics were still out there, saying he overreacted, calling it a publicity stunt. But Charles didn't waste time on noise. He had a bigger mission now. To build a future where no child, no parent, no elder, would ever be treated like they didn't belong. Where nobody had to prove their worth before being respected. And so the legacy flew on, not just in the skies, but in hearts. In minds. In change that felt real, and looked like progress. Not perfect, but forward. If this story moved you, made you think, or gave you hope, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the Story Tales for more powerful, true-to-life stories that shine a light on justice, kindness, and the human spirit. Because stories like Charles's remind us that one voice, one choice, one moment, can change everything.